Welcome, my friends. Welcome, my family. We are back. Welcome to the Deeply Serious Political Show. I like that name. We are back. Revolutionary Blackout, late night show. We have a lot of great stuff to talk about. Got great guests that's going to come on. We're going to talk about the class war that has been waged against Black Americans. Um, so we're gonna have her on. She's gonna come on in the first 30 minutes or so. But before she joins, I want to talk about what I've been warning people about for quite some time is the West going full fledged into World War III against uh, Russia and China. When I look at this new development, and now we look at the new updates that we saw regarding the CIA having active participation in Ukraine, I want to show you guys this. And if you said this a few weeks ago, you mentioned how the West is just trying to provoke Russia, trying to provoke World War III, and how we are using the Russia-Ukraine situation as a proxy war. If you brought that up just a few weeks ago, you'd be called a conspiracy theorist. We already seeing the mission creep in Ukraine. Look at this. Now we have CIA officers on the ground. So let me read this headline to you guys. We have CIA ops, commandos in Ukraine. Can we just admit we're fighting the war? You have Max Boot on MSNBC that openly admitted this. You have Biden administration officials a mid-century that we're fighting a proxy war against Russia using Ukrainian lives. So this was a report out of the New York Times. Now, as someone who has a principled stance on being anti-imperialist and I understand what warfare actually is, the West, they went through they're like, we're going to have PR and we're going to change what it means to go to war. So they like create terms like sanctions, right? Which before that, sanctions was just called siege warfare. It was called economic war. But now they're like, oh, we're just going to put sanctions on this country. And then the Biden administration, like, we the first administration in years that ended the wars. That's what they said to Afghanistan, even though they had all these sanctions. And what I have been telling people, and this is the message that should be coming from the anti-imperialists, the leftists, sanctions are an act of war. It is as violent and as brutal if you look at the amount of people that are killed and the mechanisms in which they are killed under sanctions. Not only are sanctions an act of war, which we've been waging against Russia and our geopolitical foes, anyone who steps out of U.S. Western hegemony, groupthink, we actually have CIA operatives on the ground in Russia and Ukraine. Now, imagine the restraint on Russia's part. I said the same thing about Iran. The restraint when you have the West constantly provoking them in ways that the United States would have been retaliated. Imagine if there was a hostile foreign power that was arming militants, hostile militants in Mexico, how the United States will respond. In fact, this CIA infiltration in Ukraine, this is not new. This is not new. You had the 60s, you had the CIA work with Cuban anti-Fidel Castro radicals. And they would literally turn Miami to a hub of terrorist violence because of how much they want to get rid of Castro. You had in the 80s, you had the CIA who supported, encouraged, and provided fiscal support to Islamic radicals converging in Afghanistan. A lot of these radical groups would later go on to orchestrate the 9/11 attacks. You had in 2010, you had DC, you had Washington. They backed Syria's quote unquote moderate rebels who end up committing an insane amount of atrocities, war crimes, torturing of civilians, and including attacking people in the Kurdish forces. That when you look at the Kurds, they're supposed to be U.S. allies, but we didn't care about that. And following that pattern, you had the CIA train the Exile Battalion. So when I say Russian restraint, this was a war that was started by NATO and the CIA. Look, this is what Jacobin reported. Look at this. This comes from Jacobin of all people. The CIA may be breeding Nazi terror in Ukraine. And I'm gonna tell you guys the absurdity of US policy and how we know we are in the wrong. Anyone who calls this out, they will say, "Oh, you a Putin sympathizer, you're a Russian sympathizer." But you had reports that was warning about the terrorist threat that was in Ukraine because of the Nazis in Ukraine, who believe in one people, one nation, one state. A lot of the highest members of the Exile Battalion were quoted saying this was the last frontier for the white race. And they're fighting for the ability to ethnically cleanse Ukraine from the large amount of Russian speakers, which you had like 1/3 of the country that speak Russian. You had all these ethnic minorities. They wanted to purge that to make Ukraine their one people, one state ideology, which is Nazism. You have Rokana that even called this out, who mentioned how we are funding extremist Nazis in the Ukraine. They used to mention this stuff all the time. You even had a House amendment that made it so they banned arming neo-Nazis. So in 2015, the same year the CIA started training the Azov Battalion and extremist groups in Ukraine, you also had Congress who got rid of the amendment where they can't fund neo-Nazis. And the excuse they made to get rid of that amendment was they're like, oh, it's not a big deal. There's literally no point in having this amendment. It's redundant because we're not going to fund Nazis anyway. And that was the messaging they used. And then as soon as they scrapped that amendment, they immediately started sending funds and munitions to the Azov Battalion. And U.S. arms flowed to the militia. NATO and U.S. military officials was literally pictured meeting with the Azov Battalion. But if you bring up pictures, if you bring up these past relations, people were like, oh man, you're just a Putin sympathizer. I want to show you guys this. This is not just me saying this. I'm going to show you guys this lecture from someone who they calling out the West for their influence and the way they provoked this conflict. Check this video out.
A de facto member of NATO. The alliance began training the Ukrainian military in 2014, averaging 10,000 trained troops annually over the next 8 years. NATO was training 10,000 troops per year for 8 straight years. In December 2017, the Trump administration decided to provide Kyiv with defensive weapons. Other NATO countries quickly got into the act, shipping even more weapons to Ukraine. In addition, Ukraine's military participated in joint military exercises with NATO forces. In July 2021, less than a year ago, Kyiv and Washington co-hosted Operation Seabreeze, a naval exercise in the Black Sea that included navies from 31 countries and was directly aimed at Russia. 2 months later, in September 2021, the Ukraine Army led Rapid Trident 21, which was, according to an official press release from the U.S. Army, It was, quote, a U.S. Army Europe and Africa assisted annual exercise designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations. Remember, I'm making the argument here. We were turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. It was designed to enhance interoperability among allied and partner nations to demonstrate units are poised and ready to respond to any crisis. NATO's efforts to arm and train Ukraine's military explains in good part why it has fared so well against Russian forces in the ongoing war. It's not simply Russian incompetence. It's the fact that we armed and trained those Ukrainian forces and turned them into a formidable fighting force. A headline in a recent issue of the Wall Street Journal.
The reason why I'm bringing this up is because these very basic facts is what everyone wants to pretend is not the case when covering this conflict. Based on what he has said and what I already explained to you in the lead up to this, the West got involved in Ukraine and made the conflict, the civil war in the Ukraine, worse by arming the most extremist elements from Western Ukraine because they knew they would have the Azov extremist fighters that are willing to fight Russia. Now, Russia wanted to halt the expansion of NATO as per the Minsk agreement, which was already broken. Ukraine is a NATO state in all but name only. Look at the response, which gets into what I want to talk about now, which is even crazier. And I covered how you have Finland and Sweden, who was in discussions with joining NATO, even though they essentially, all these countries are de facto NATO. They're hostile towards Russia, tolerate anti-Russian foreign policy. The West continue to probe them. Do you guys know the CIA launched cyber attacks into Russia infrastructure? The quote-unquote Russian puppet, Putin puppet, Donald Trump, he launched these attacks. Let me show you this. So nothing but restraint on behalf of Russia, as far as I'm concerned. Look at this. Report. CIA conducted cyber attacks against Iran and Russia after secret Trump order in 2018. You see why Russiagate never made any sense? You had Trump literally opposing Putin geopolitically everywhere, including cooling Venezuela, expanding NATO, and launching literally cyber attacks in their infrastructure. They were literally aiming for financial infrastructure. All this, and Russia haven't started World War III. All this escalation, the fact that the West is now trying to tank the global economy just to provoke Russia more. And then you have Russia, after they've broken the Minsk agreement, you had Ukraine looking to join NATO openly. They're essentially a de facto NATO state. Even with all this, Russia is like, okay, there's no reason to have Finland and Sweden expand NATO. Think about what Russia demand has been, which is 100% reasonable, and it aligns with my interest as an anti-imperialist, especially as someone who Black and colonized. NATO has been a colonizing power. It's been an imperialist power, including helping colonizers in Europe maintain their colonial power in Africa, including the colonial Portuguese. And they essentially provided a new rules-based order that protects the colonizers and the imperialists who are committing insane war crimes and provide them a shield against the poor, Black, and colonized people in which they wage war against. That's why we should oppose NATO. So it just so happened our interests align. We need to see this influence scale back. So they already continue to spend past Berlin, breaking their agreement. And now Russia was like, okay, you guys are no Finland or Sweden. And they raised the nuclear threat on that. Because now you guys talking about insane national security threat against Russia, which they already been tolerating since the United States have military bases that surrounded their entire country. Right? So now you have more, like, this is insane. I covered this many times. I talk about the lead up to this. NATO reaches a deal with Turkey to admit Sweden and Finland, General Secretary says. Let's read the cliff notes. And this the rationale that these people are giving towards escalating nuclear war, World War III, is unhinged, and I'm gonna explain here soon. So before, Turkey was the only country that had the spine to stand up to Russia. To stand up to the West, and they wasn't doing it because they had morals or principles. And when I covered this at first, I was clear about that. They were trying to attract concessions, which they did. Which I'm very interested in seeing the ramifications of this. You had the West essentially turn their back on the Kurds. Sweden that is now lifting their arms embargo. We're gonna get to the what Turkey won, because it's not even accurate to say that Turkey folded. They won out of this because they were the only countries that had the balls that said, "Okay, I see how much you want to win this conflict." The United States, the West. So let's get something out of it, and they did. But anyway, but look at this: the push to add Sweden and Finland comes as Russia's assault on Ukraine stroked fears of other countries in the region. Guys, this makes no sense. Think about this. They say, "Oh, Russia invaded Ukraine, so we have a hostile military in this region, a hostile nation. So now, who knows? What if Russia invades us next?" Which completely erased all the historical context that I laid out for you guys. This is about anti-Russian aggression on behalf of the West and the expansion of NATO. Reaching peace in this war has always been clear. Stop the expansion of NATO, keep Ukraine a neutral territory, a neutral country, and denazify the region, which I agree with. We need to get rid of Azov Battalion and their influence that they get from the West and on the highest levels of government, the amount of Nazis that infiltrated Ukraine. When I look at the ads on Russia on this conflict, it's very reasonable. But they are pretending, the West is pretending that Russia is launching this war just because they want territory, because they want to expand and create a new USSR. That is not what they're doing. In fact, they was willing to allow Ukraine to concede and Zelensky to remain leader as long as they could decide to be neutral and demilitarize their Nazis. But in order to justify the expansion of NATO, which the arms weapon manufacturers want, they got to pretend that Russia is this crazy state that's just going to randomly invade countries out of nowhere. And the greatest irony in this is they feel like these countries are under threat because Russia invaded Ukraine. But by deciding to join NATO, they are actually putting more people in danger. So Sweden and Finland will have no reason to have concern unless they join NATO, which will break a contract they had since the 90s where they declared neutrality. So if you actually want to keep your people safe, the best thing you can do is to remain neutral. The only thing that will pull Russia in to your country, the only thing that will pull you into this conflict is if you decide to join NATO, which they did. And their argument was, well, we got to be prepared just in case Russia invade. Guys, Sweden and Finland are members of the EU. They are EU states. So as an EU state, you already get security assurances in case you're invaded by a hostile power. They know this, but whenever they talk about this, they ignore this. They leave this part out, and they pretend that they are defenseless countries. Just in case Russia may invade, they will have no help. And if you guys believe that is the case, look at Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't NATO, and look at the support they are getting. You guys see the bullshit and the lies they are telling. This is what the prime minister of Sweden and Finland, the first ever quote unquote progressive female leaders in these countries, who've been telling people that, oh man, Russia's gonna invade. Things gonna be worse if we don't join NATO. Even though the only way this conflict gets worse if they do join NATO. While at the same time leaving out the fact that they will always have protections at being a member of the EU. So this is the West looking for World War III. This is the West looking for World War III. Now, Turkey held firm on this for a while. I'm gonna go over the concessions they had. I don't have a lot of time because I know my guest's probably gonna join me here in the last 10 minutes. I'm sorry I didn't have time to check out the comments. I'm very short on time. So I wanted to cover this at least before my guests come. We're gonna have Malaika on. She's a writer for Essence and great on economics and Black issues. So we're gonna talk about that here soon. So here are the concessions that Turkey got. And this is what I mentioned earlier before. We all knew that Turkey, they wasn't doing this because they actually cared about opposing U.S. hegemony. This is just them trying to get concessions, right? So these are the concessions that Turkey got. Excuse me, let me drink my tea. So here we are. So here are the things that Turkey got. Sweden and Finland will lift its arms embargo. Both will support Turkey on PKK. Stop support to YPG. They will amend their laws on terrorism. They will share intel with each other. They will extradite terror suspects. What? Now this is big because Sweden always opposed Turkey on their war and their conflict against the Kurds. And I'm not like an expert on the situation, but I know there's like 30 million Kurds who live in the Middle East around mostly Iran, Iraq, Syria, Turkey. In Turkey in particular, the Kurds are around 1/5 of the population. And they've been waging an insurgency since the late 70s, early 80s, because they wanted to get greater authority for the culture and political rights, because Turkey is a very authoritarian, especially under Erdogan, is very they crush dissent, especially any popular consent is crushed. So they've been fighting Erdogan. You even had Noam Chomsky, who I disagree with, said that the U.S. forces should stay in Syria just to support the Kurds because they usually are close West allies. But with that said, now this is the West completely throwing the Kurds under the bus to give Erdogan everything that he wants, so they can join NATO. Now, hopefully, I give you guys a little bit of background to that. I got only a few more minutes left. I want to show you guys this. I shared this article on my call-in, but I want to show you guys why this is even more insane. Here, look at this headline. Biden officials privately doubt that Ukraine can win back all its territory. Remember, we covered how there was whispers in the West and in the Biden administration about how they feel like their sanctions was backfiring, which everyone knew was going to happen. Now they're feeling the political pressure and fallback from that. They're becoming laughingstocks because of their strategy. Now they're like, shit, Ukraine probably it's probably over. It's already over. Look at this. Advisors to President Joe Biden began debating internally how whether Ukrainian President Zelensky should shift its definition of a Ukrainian victory, adjusting for the possibility that his country has shrunk irreversibly, meaning that Russia has won so many battles and taken so many territories, despite the mainstream narrative that for weeks been trying to tell you that Russia miscalculated, the Ukrainians are winning. So now this is the mainstream media, this is the West finally coming out and saying, oh, yeah, this shit's over. We all knew Ukraine had zero chance, even with the West pumping their military to like the fourth largest military in the world. Even with that, there was no chance of them winning this conflict. The only option for the West was peace. But in order to sell weapons, in order to funnel arms into Ukraine, they can't have people believe that this was a lost cause, right? So look at this. We all know the West, their plan was to fight until the last Ukrainian. In order for what? In order to expand NATO and to deliver a geopolitical defeat to Putin. That's it. Look at the next paragraphs. U.S. officials emphasized to CNN that this pessimistic assessment, which I call a realistic assessment, does not mean the U.S. plans to pressure Ukraine into making any concessions to Russia. So on one end, you have the Biden administration admitting that Ukraine can't win. But at the same time, the U.S. is sending billions in weapons to Ukraine while not even asking the Ukrainians to seek peace. Do you guys see how unhinged the West is? They have an unending expansion of NATO in order to provoke Russia. They want to put Sweden and Finland in NATO in order to provoke Russia and to provoke World War III. They're doing all this, investing all these resources, allowing all these Ukrainians to die for a conflict they already plan to lose. So it's almost like this is really about just enriching arms dealers. Almost like it's all about funneling money to the oligarchs that support this war, Zelensky, the Western Ukrainians that was the puppets of the West. So I know we got our guest probably gonna join here soon, but there's still a lot to say. There's still a lot to say on this. I guess maybe I should do a chat. Bob said, in the end, Ukraine will lose. Zelensky will be killed by the CIA or his own Azov. That's an interesting prediction on Zelensky. I think the West gonna try their best to protect their boy because he played his role on this pretty well. The only way I think the last two things happen if Zelensky comes out of nowhere and he's like, I want peace. And then he actually, imagine if he starts exposing the West, trying to push him to edge on endless conflict. Yeah, then he's a dead man. But he just had Ben Stiller on. He's doing a fucking PR tour all around the world right now. I think Zelensky is willing to be a Western puppet for as long as it takes. So even worst case scenario for him, the West just fucking evacuate him. He permanently live in the UK or US somewhere. I think Zelensky will be okay, and that what makes it even more damning what he's doing. He ran on peace in order to become president, and now that he got a lot of pressure from the Azov Battalion in the West, he's willing to allow his people to die for the goal of expanding NATO, which is damning, right? He's like killed by the CIA, equal killed by Azov. Pretty much the same unit. They got the same goals and objectives. A lot of people thought Nazism lost after World War II, but NATO essentially recruited them. The West recruited them. And then they essentially continued Nazi ideology of full spectrum dominance, white power as well. They have fucking Israel that's doing the same thing to Palestinians as the Nazis was doing to them. They're bombing their homes. They're displacing their people, shooting and killing journalists. It sucks that we thought the bad guys were just defeated. and I'm working on an article. My next article, I want to talk about how like Trumpism was never defeated. Like people keep thinking these evils are defeated, but they was never defeated. It just was recycled and rebranded to Joe Biden and the Democratic Party. Let's see. Let's see if we can find some more comments here. Obama ran on shutting down Gitmo, but he became a war criminal instead. Yep. Explain to people how Barack Obama bombed so many people. He ran out of bombs. Never forget the war criminal, Barack Obama. I'm gonna show you. This is a great tweet from Caitlin Johnstone, friend of the show, regarding what we were just covering. So the Western Empire is responding to a war that was caused by NATO expansion, by greatly expanding NATO. At the same time, we learn the Biden administration doesn't even believe Ukraine has any chance at winning the war. This is going great, guys. Great job, everybody. That's why there's so many people that have no idea what is going on in this war. This is what I pretty much just read. This is the receipt on the Ukraine story. I love how we have someone who's saying that Putin has been defeated. They're taking their time, man. Ruble is strong. They are forming this alliance against Western hegemony. You had the Summit of Americas that was a disaster that flopped. Only like 4 out of like 55 of the African delegation appeared when Zelensky was giving his speeches. The Americans now realize that their own people was sanctioned. And the Biden administration is continuing to get worse. Look at this story. I'm going to show you guys this. As Americans continue to starve, as more people continue to fall into poverty, look at this. Congress wants to spend $45 million on nukes the Navy said it doesn't even need. Man, Biden about killed all of us. Remember when it was when everyone pretended that Donald Trump was going to be the cause of nuclear war? Now you got Joe Biden openly saying that World War III is right around the corner. And now you got them escalating the nuclear arms race. The U.S. Armed Service Committee added an amendment to the 2023 military budget that will continue to fund the development of sea-launched nuclear cruise missiles. This despite the Navy's own budget zeroing out the item, saying it doesn't need the nukes, and the Biden White House saying the weapons were unnecessary. Endless march towards militarism. We actually have our guests that join us. Let me know when you're ready. Just give me a thumbs up when you're good to go, and we will introduce you. And to introduce our next topic, because now actually I'm gonna shift gears. I'm gonna shift gears here because we have done many streams. We talk about reparations, and I always bring up the fact that I don't understand why people will like separate between like race and class when those two things to me are interconnected and intertwined. Like when you had the amount of wealth that was stolen from our communities, we had the amount of labor and the generational wealth that was stolen from our society. We had civil asset forfeiture that targets Black people at around a 60% rate. You see a massive state crackdown, not only on Black and colonized people, this affects our wealth, this affects our class as well. And this is why having conversations about not only just economic justice, but things like reparations is extremely important as well. So with that said, I wanted to bring this guest on because I read a great article she had where she was talking about reparations, because what the Democratic Party would do instead, they would say, "Oh, look, we're gonna make Juneteenth a national holiday." You have Nancy Pelosi who would kneel in kente cloth. Meanwhile, there are real economic needs of Black Americans that are simply not being met. So I want to introduce our guest. I want to make sure I get this correct. Is Malaika? Am I getting that correct? All right. Let me put the name tags up here as well, so you guys. I think it make it easier for you guys to see. Welcome. Thanks for joining Revolutionary Blackout. I love the work that I see you put out there. Malaika Jabali, you're the senior news and politics editor for the Essence magazine. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. We interacted on Twitter. I don't know how long it's been now, but
Yeah.
glad to join the show.
Yeah, I'm glad I was finally able to get you on. I have like this large guest list of people I always see who just put base content out there, and I'm glad we finally was able to get you on. So here's the article that you wrote, and one of the reasons why it caught my eye, I read through it and I wanted to have a conversation with you because we did our Juneteenth stream, and I people who not like who didn't know our channel probably was probably surprised by it because we named it like Juneteenth stream and obviously we glad that there's a recognition that this is becoming at least the acknowledgement of Black Panthers becoming more mainstream. But I want to see more tangibles, especially for my people. But before we actually get into the weeds, I actually want to get a chance for you to introduce yourself to a new audience, like how you got into writing and the kind of work you do, just so as an introduction, any way you want to take it before we actually dive hard into the issue. Thank
Sure.
you for joining again.
Of course. So as you mentioned, the senior news and politics editor at Essence. I was freelancing for them, doing some political writing for a few years. But I'm an attorney by trade, a public policy attorney. That's what I went to school for. And I realized, really, even before I even started law school, that I did not want to be a lawyer. But you got to have something in your back pocket, and it was a very expensive, fat back pocket that I ended up putting as a plan B, which was law school, but I always wanted to do something creative. And so I started freelance writing when I was in school as a creative outlet. And who knew I was trying to get away from the law, but so much of my politics writing lately has been about the law, from Supreme Court cases to legislation that's happening in all these state legislatures. So it comes in handy sometimes.
Yeah. I just released my last op-ed. I was talking about the police state, and I remember when I was in school when I used to hate writing and doing these articles, but that because they used to make me write about stuff I didn't care about,
Right.
right? But when it comes to like writing about like the struggles that I see, like something that I'm passionate about, I be writing. I had like cut stuff from articles. I'd be having so much written down. It is actually a really great outlet, and especially as a commentator, helped me collect my thoughts. So this is the article that you wrote. Here's the title. I like the premise especially. We need reparations, not just representation. Now, I often say that the Democratic Party and in general the liberal class, they bastardize what identity politics and representation, what we really talking about, at least what I really mean when we talking about what we need as a Black community. What they would just see, we got Lloyd Austin, who's a defense secretary now. Barack Obama, the first Black president. We got Kamala Harris, who's the first female Black president. We got Jim Clyburn. Job's done. You guys see all these Black faces in high places. So what would you like to see more coming from the establishment, and just instead of, before we get to reparations, instead of just this blind mindless game of just, oh, we put someone who looked like you in this place, what do you think should be done more? I'll pass that up as a just a follow-up question on that.
Sure. And I'm going to address that, but I also want to just address the framing, because I said not just representation, because I do believe that there is room for that. Just so people are aware, this is the 50th anniversary of the 1972 Gary, Indiana Convention. It was a national Black political convention held in Gary, Indiana, that included Black people from all political stripes. They range from Black nationalists to just your standard Black liberals and integrationists to revolutionaries and socialists. And so this conference ended up really birthing a new Black political movement where you saw the first Black mayors for the first time. You saw the mayor of my city, Maynard Jackson in Atlanta. And so at that time, you did not even have Black political power. So it was a call to arms to then say, okay, we need to have people who look like us who then represent us. So not who are symbols, not people who are merely idols, but actual representation. You know how we say no taxation without representation? So representation isn't just merely about what people look like, it's about actually reflecting kind of the views of the people that you claim to be representing. And so for Black people, that was like a proxy to have Black people in power, which came, so this came out of the Black Power movement, was proxy to then actually provide real tangible things for Black people. We got the faces, we got the positions, but we didn't get the power. And so I do think it is important for Black people to have power, and that looks like representation, but it's not the same thing. And so, you know, growing up in Atlanta, it was helpful to see a Black mayor. It was helpful to see a Black fire chief and Black principals, because our identity has so far been heavily attached to, you know, to being dehumanized, to be treated as second-class citizens. So I thought it fortified me growing up to have that representation. So I think it's important, but it's not nearly enough. You know, this is a socialist podcast. I am a socialist, and I recognize that race and class are interwoven. And so we do need to address the class issue. And I don't think we can even fully achieve racial parity without overall economic parity in this country.
Yeah, that's very well said. And this is what a lot of people in the liberal class they get wrong. And it's great to have the representation, but it's also very important to have the diversity of thought. So
Mm-hmm.
what's the point of just saying, oh, we hired all these Black people, we got people that look like you, if everyone had the same ideology of neoliberal capitalism? Right? When you look at our revolutionary leaders, they were socialists. MLK was a socialist. Fred Hampton was a Marxist-Leninist. You had Malcolm X, who was socialist. But when you look at the Black leaders who are elevated by the people in power, they all believe in Reagan capital, not even just like standard social democrat
Hashtag
capitalism.
capitalism, FDR. No,
Yeah, not even
just
that. Just Reagan
neoliberalism.
capitalism. So and I'm gonna take the time to switch to reparations because we got all these Black people in power, which like obviously what you said makes 100% sense. Like it's great for us to see people that look like us in power, but they all like unifiedly against like reparations. Like if you look at the Black Congressional Caucus, they all stand against reparations. So I'm gonna stand this up as a toss up, and you can take it out as you want. Why do you think there's like this hesitation from what I call the Black capitalist class
Yeah.
to support reparations? You want to take that on?
Well, I mean, they support HR 40, which is a commission to study reparations on a federal level. But I think the problem is just a two-party system. There's not a reparations agenda in the Democratic Party platform. So what Black leaders within the Democratic Party, and this is specifically federal leadership, because we should make that distinction between what's happening on the state and local level, where there are actually movements in legislative bodies to move towards reparations commissions, whether that's in New York State or whether that's in California or whether that's in New Jersey. So it is happening with like small D Democrats on a local level, but on a federal level, they're going to go with what the party leadership says. And if party leadership is still, as it's always been, trying to triangulate and appeal to some white elites, still trying to get some of those swing voters, some of those suburban moms, they know that in their minds, they have the Black vote. So you do not need to prioritize reparations on the list. And so if that's what the national leadership is saying, people are going to go down the party line and agree with that. I mean, we just had a massive social movement where it was clear that I would say the majority of this country was interested in some sort of federal police reform, and we couldn't even get that passed with this national party leadership. So there's a tendency, as we all know, I think most people watching here, to have kind of arm's length distance when it comes to Black voters, where their votes are definitely used, but their policy issues aren't prioritized.
Well said. Now I'm gonna ask you this question because you wrote and you explained the need for reparations in a great way in the article. Instead of just reading the article live here, I'm gonna ask you to make the case for reparations. We talk about it all the time, but I would love to hear your argument. So let's just say I'm like some guy, I'm a poor white worker. I'm like, no, reparations. Why do you think you deserve reparations? How will you? What is the argument that you would like to present?
Well, I mean, our country is bigger than a poor white guy. So I'm just going to make the case in general. I think for socialists, for people who want a better world, I do not see us having the socialist future that we want in America without providing some economic restitution to Black people who built the capitalist system that this country is based on, and the capitalist system that really was the engine for global capitalism throughout the world. So even if we were able to say, you know what, you're probably familiar with Richard Wolff, we have some worker self-directed enterprises. When you kind of look at that on a micro level, if you have workers who are coming together to make democratic decisions, who is more likely to be able to take off from work and boycott? Who is more likely to be able to strike? Who is more likely able to protest? People with a little bit of an economic cushion. You don't have an economic cushion if you have 10 times less wealth than your white coworkers. Who is going to be most likely to have, their needs met and have a job? Because we've had years of racial discrimination, years of wealth extraction from the Black community, to the point where a lot of Black people don't even have jobs. So how do we have a unified working class when we are not even coming from the same starting point? So I think for a lot of socialists, we want to believe that we are already starting from zero, even as workers. And that's not the case. If you kind of take a Marxist analysis to it, a lot of Black people are in the lumpen proletariat. Like, we're not even in the proletariat because we don't have the jobs, we don't have the access, we don't have homes. 70% of white people have homes. That is a function of government policy. Like, this isn't out of thin air. Actual government policy extracted wealth from Black communities, literally gave wealth to white communities so they could have some financial security. So I believe that a working class that is more financially secure is actually more amenable to changing the system, because they're not always on survival mode. And Black people are constantly on survival mode. And when you have 10 times less wealth, when you can't afford a home, when you're housing insecure, it's harder to organize around that.
That's a powerful argument, and I love the language that you're speaking. You're speaking my language because these are the arguments I would use often, because we got a lot of like white socialists and Marxists that are watching this, and I always say I don't know why, especially if you like poor and white, why you would be against it. It's not like we're taking money from you per se. And as a Marxist, and since you're introducing socialist thought, I'm gonna add this as well, because our job, and this is what Michael Prenti advocated for. As Marxists, we trying to reallocate the wealth. We're trying to get the wealth back from the top 1%, from the rich and wealthy. Social democrats and people who call themselves democratic socialists, they advocate for what Michael Prenti and other Marxists consider a liberal reform, which is taxing the rich. And once again, this comes from Prenti himself. Taxing the rich, as a Marxist, I don't oppose that, because we're supposed to strive for anything that gets closer to strengthening the proletariat. But we got to understand that's necessarily a reform, because taxing it's implying that this is a wealth that was gained in a moral and ethical sense based on what our society is being ran by. So if we are Marxists and we talking about reparations, we talking about reallocating the wealth to the people who was exploited. Marxism challenges capitalism because we challenge the exploitation of the system. So you couldn't have a more efficient and better kicking off point to what we need to have reallocate the wealth and gain proletariat power. I love that point that you bring up there. So let me ask you this. I want to ask you another question. What do you think is the biggest misconception that a lot of people have regarding reparations, and what do you think a lot of people get wrong, if you want to take that on?
What is the biggest misconception? I think maybe a mainstream misconception is that it only is about slaveholders. And so if you did not have a direct hand in plantation slavery, then there's no reason for us to have reparations today. And first of all, it's a little bit kind of a fallacious argument, because if you were not involved in plantation slavery, then you have no like basis to be upset about us getting repayment for that. So if you're saying that it was so long ago and you have nothing to do with it, then the people who are getting paid aren't getting paid by you. So I just never really understood that. I just don't really understand that argument, because it doesn't involve you. You're absolutely right. It doesn't involve you. We're talking about an entire economic system that benefited from it. At the same time, years of housing policy, New Deal policy, policies that extended from this creation, this invention, this construction of race that stemmed from slavery, also has led to a lot of the racial disparities, racial wealth disparities that we have right now. And so in 1862, when we had the Homestead Act that was passed, that's another example of basically funneling wealth to white households, where about a quarter of white households today, and this is what I wrote in the column based on research from I want to make sure I get her name right, Carrie Lee Merritt, based on her research, and she's a scholar from Georgia. About a quarter of families, white households today, are the recipients of the wealth that was passed down from those land grants. Wow. So this is a call for the government. We're not asking you individually to get money out of your pocket.
Right. And I want to see you agree with this, because I made this argument on the earlier streams talking about reparations. And the reason why I do this is because when we have these conversations among ourselves, when a lot of Black people talk about this issue, it's easy to get them on our side. And it like, honestly, it really is. I want to appeal people who they have otherwise anti-establishment views, but for some reason they want to resist this. And that does not make sense to me. Obviously, there are people that would argue that's anti-Blackness, but just for the sense of wanting to win you guys over, I'm going to give you guys the benefit of the doubt and to say there's a misunderstanding. And I want to see if you agree with this, because this is my take. Even if you are white, if you're a working class white person, you will benefit from reparations, because that is simply how markets work. We talking about uplifting the proletariat. So if we had a reparation system that gave cash to a ton of Black people in this country, well, pretty much everyone whose dad is old, right? And if you have if you got a business that's in Black communities, or even not even a largely Black community, you got people who have money in their hands. So having the people who have the least amount of spending power, but having reparation passed, you turn the people with the least amount of spending power to a giant spending block. How do you guys think this is not going to benefit the economy? How do you guys think this is not going to turn around and benefit yourself? Imagine if you had like a liquor store in the ghetto or something, right? You have any establishment, right? This will only benefit you. And this is also why, as a socialist, I would love to see stuff like healthcare being involved in that. I would love to see Medicare for all implemented, because I don't want to see our money go right into like medical debt, which Black people hold a large amount. I don't want our money go right back to landlords. So these are conversations that we got to have while we fight for this. But the point is, this will always help you guys, especially if you're poor white and the wealth is not coming from you guys. Hopefully that makes sense. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think there are valid reasons why people are opposed to it. I just think that a lot of those reasons are more emotional than logical. I think most people would say if you have been exploited for centuries by a government, you should get some restitution from that. But the idea that you can have a benefit go exclusively to one race, on the surface of that seems like that's reverse racism. That seems like that's unfair. And you're going to have backlash, I think, across, ideology when it comes to white communities and also non-Black communities of color, where they're going to feel like there's an unfair advantage bestowed upon Black people. And I think this is also kind of the double-edged sword of representation, because as much as Black people hoop and holler and we get on TV and we get in commercials and we get movies, it gives the impression that we have a lot more power and influence than we do. And so I think it builds resentment that, well, why are these people special? And it's like, we're not trying to be special. We're asking for legitimate things, but this is what we're getting in return. This is what the system is saying all that they can do for us. We're going to get a few people who are elevated in certain symbolic positions, but we're still not given any material benefits. And so I think it creates that kind of resentment where it seems like there's this like reverse racism going on because of the way that we have gifted Black people symbolic things in this country. And that matters to some people. And that, again, builds resentment among some communities. You know, the same thing during Reconstruction, when it was said that we're going to get 40 acres and a mule. There was immense white backlash to the point where, you know, they had to be a compromise where we got, you know, a Democratic president who was racist to preside. That was the compromise so that we could get Confederate troops out of the South. So we've had this ongoing battle where, you know, Black people's issues, our priorities, our material interests still aren't being met because it looks like we're doing better than we actually are. And honestly, it's like, you're not going to win everybody over. Like, our people are struggling. So I personally, I'm very open to other people engaging in these conversations with, you know, with folks who disagree. But I need to focus on how we can get that for our communities because we're struggling way too much for me to lose sight of that.
Yeah, and the point you made is something that I mentioned earlier, where I said, imagine how fast, and we talk about how much reparations is owed, and we talk about trillions, right? But I pointed out, imagine how fast white people hit the streets if the U.S. government just cut $50 billion for reparations, the same way they just sent to Ukraine. They sent it to Ukraine. There are some backlash, but it generally accepted, right? If they cut a check for Black Americans for $50 billion for reparations, there would be white people in the street rioting that same day. So I'm just asking you guys to ask yourself what that is. And there is what I try to avoid. This is why I think critical solidarity, this is why I think Marxist thought, anti-U.S. hegemony thought helps in decolonize your mind so you don't have this oppression Olympics that I think you kind of hinted to as well, where you have people who are victims of white supremacy as well. They're like, oh, why are these Black motherfuckers getting this, right? Like, and you have some people like, oh, well, I literally argue with some adults, people I disagree with, who like, we shouldn't care about immigration issues. The Latinos, they don't care about us. I'm like, what you guys are doing only benefiting white supremacy. We got to avoid that divide and conquer. We got to learn critical solidarity, because critical solidarity will help us avoid falling into these mental traps that the establishment will only benefit from. So I told you guys, I call for reparations for the Palestinian people. I think they deserve reparations. I think the kids in cages deserve reparations. Reparations is a concept of a debt owed, a healing that must be done by an evil empire. Do you have anything to add to that before I ask you the final question?
Period. Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. And then people are like, well, in that case, then Native Americans need to be getting reparations. The Japanese, well, they have, first of all. And I agree. Anyone who has been harmed by, you know, these Western systems should get their money back. Like, they should get what they're owed, because it was not only economic failure, but it was a moral crisis as well, to define a whole people as being essentially chattel, as, you know, no more than livestock. I think we should demand that. We should demand that. All of us should demand that of our government. If we care about equality, if we care about equity, I think at the fundamental level, socialists care about fairness and humanity and caring about other people. And if you care about other people, then this should be something that we all universally care about.
I appreciate you joining me. The last question I'll ask you, you mentioned how Black people can't educate our way out of this. Meaning, we hear a lot of times what liberals and conservatives, capitalists in general, what they say. They're like, yeah, we know you guys went through a lot of strife earlier, but all you gotta do is work hard, study hard, go to Ivy League education, everything will be all right. Do you want to take that on? Because I love the point that you make in your article.
Sure. And I will say I'm building on an argument that Sandy Darity has made. He has, along with some other scholars, there's a paper that they wrote about just myths revolving the Black wealth gap, and how education and homeownership, a lot of those things are brought up as, policy remedies in order to tighten the gap. But like with anything else, there has to be a racial lens when we're looking at economics in this country. And so for years, education was free. And somehow, when we started to have desegregation in this country around the 60s and 70s, around the Nixon administration, is when we started to introduce this concept of education access and educational loans and having to borrow. So instead of having access simply to education, we had more access to indebtedness. We became, just more, just a whole class of creditors in our educational system. And so if you look at the way that education loans have exploded, it's affecting Black millennials more than any other group of people. And that's not by accident. In order to, I would say, to appease concerns about public education being integrated, as in public higher education, there had to be some limits. And so tuitions increased. And then you had to take out credit in order to pay for that tuition. And that disproportionately affects Black borrowers and Black women borrowers in particular. And so the gap between Black millennials and everybody else is larger than it was for Black, like Gen Xers, Black baby boomers, and their white and non-Black counterparts. So the racial wealth gap, basically, what I'm saying, the racial wealth gap has grown because we are tying education to credit instead of just merely having education as a right. So that is, one reason why it has not created parity, because it's so tied to indebtedness. But the other is simply that once people get educated, the idea is that they'll get a college degree, they'll be able to have, more opportunities in the workplace. But then when you factor in job discrimination, when you factor in the fact that a lot of places where Black people have worked, in places that, may not even necessarily require a degree, a lot of those jobs don't exist anymore. So education cannot be a cure-all for something that is fundamentally, it should be tied to what should be a right. And, reparations is the only kind of massive social program that we have that can limit the extremely large wealth gap that we have today.
Well said, Malaika. And that's an argument that we must consider, because I said that, at least my point of view, we're not going to capitalism our way out of our oppression. Despite the fact that we had a boom in Black millionaires because of the entertainment business, the income gap between Black and white Americans is higher than it was in the civil rights era. And that's despite the boom of Black millionaires. So doesn't that say a lot about how this capitalist system is continuing to make our situations worse? But with that said, I appreciate you joining me. This was a great conversation. Great having you on. I'm glad that you was able to educate us more on reparations. Anything you want to shout out where they can find your work? Any final thoughts?
Sure. So this column that's up on the Essence website, We Need Reparations, Not Just Representation, is a part of a column that I've had in the magazine for the last several issues called Hear Me Out. So I take up a different issue, just yelling out to people, every other month. So that's the main place you can find me, essence.com.
Yeah, well said. Thank you for joining us, and make sure you guys check her out. And I'm gonna have Fiorella Isabel from the Combo Couch. She's gonna be joining me on Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern time. We're gonna obviously have a great foreign policy discussion. Make sure you guys check out our show we did earlier today, and also I had my revolutionary discourse on call-in. Always a great time talking to you guys. So make sure you guys subscribe to that, like, share the stream if you enjoyed. But once again, thank you guys for watching. Social Cinema, we sign out.